Hello, and thank you for stopping by this talk. I'm Jessica Perrotte, and I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Texas State University. So today I'm going to share some research stemming from my dissertation work at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where I completed my PhD. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge sources of support for the earlier phases of this work while I was a predoctoral fellow. So this work was supported by NIAAA through a predoctoral fellowship and some small research grants through APA and the Society for Health Psychology. Also, though, I'd like to go ahead and acknowledge the collaborators on this project at the beginning of this presentation rather than at the end. Several of these collaborators were members of my dissertation committee and really played a major role in helping conceptualize, and develop this project. I'd like to give an extra special shout out, of course, to Doctors Michael Bauman and Brandy Pena Watson. They were major collaborators in helping me develop a new measure that I'll be highlighting later in this talk. And of course, just many thanks to all involved. It is well known among alcohol researchers that Latinx Americans are disproportionately burdened by adverse consequences related to alcohol use as compared to non-Latinx whites. Latinxes are more likely to have alcohol-related liver disease, for example, and experience more severe alcohol dependence, but are also less likely to receive treatment for dependence than non-Latinx whites. Now, this is particularly interesting and concerning in light of evidence that often suggests Latinxes drink at about the same rate as their non-Latinx white counterparts. Similar to research on drinking in other groups, there is a lot of evidence that suggests Latino men drink more than Latino women in the U.S. I do need to note here that there is a growing evidence that this gender gap in drinking is narrowing, but the general pattern of gender differences are often still found in research. Some theorists assert that engaging in alcohol use and similar other reckless behaviors are incorporated into masculine gender role scripts. That is, for some, drinking alcohol may be something that a man does in an effort to prove his manliness. From a gender identity perspective, one might suggest that drinking alcohol is incorporated into a masculine gender schema. From a social constructionist perspective, one might say that drinking alcohol is a way masculinity is performed, perhaps in a social space. There have been some studies that suggest that Latino men are encouraged to engage in alcohol use and other risky behaviors while Latino women are not, supporting the notion that for Latino men, drinking alcohol may be considered part of an overarching gender role script. Masculinity for Latino men has often been referred to as machismo. Past conceptualizations of machismo have often focused on a single dimension, characterizing the construct as hypermasculine, dominant, and aggressive. However, researchers have increasingly moved away from conceptualizing traditional Latino gender roles with this unidimensional perspective, particularly when it's negative connotations. It's not that these elements of masculinity don't exist, but that's not all there is. For instance, Arciniega and colleagues developed the traditional machismo and caballerismo scale. This measure includes a dimension of masculinity labeled traditional machismo, which is comprised of items characterized by aggression, dominance, and emotional repression, among other things. This scale includes another dimension of masculinity labeled caballerismo. Unlike traditional machismo, caballerismo is about being a gentleman. It's about treating others with respect, loving and honoring family, using good manners, and being chivalrous, among other things. Importantly, there's robust evidence across many studies that men endorse caballerismo significantly more than traditional machismo, and the magnitude of the difference between the endorsements of the constructs is large. So that's important to note overall. Evidence shows that men tend to believe much more strongly in the masculine ideals set forth by caballerismo than traditional machismo. But to the extent that the variability in either of the two constructs can predict variability in alcohol use or related behaviors, it is important to study both. As far as linking traditional masculine gender roles to drinking using this bidimensional traditional machismo and caballerismo framework, the literature is scarce but growing. On the left side of this slide, I highlight findings pertaining to traditional machismo. As one might expect, given the characterization of the construct, traditional machismo appears to be fairly robustly related to drinking across Latino populations. Caballerismo is less clear. One study has suggested that caviarismo may be protective against binge drinking among college students, but other studies largely find that caviarismo is unrelated to drinking. In a literature review on traditional gender roles and alcohol use among Latinx men and women, a colleague and I found that a major limitation of the existing literature is that the measures used to assess TMGR are belief-based. That is, these are measures that are designed to capture what men believe they should do. Folks familiar with self-discrepancy theory might think of this as the ought self, how a man thinks he ought to behave. But how someone thinks they ought to behave isn't how someone always behaves. What about that actual self? For men, how are these masculinities actually being enacted, and how does the enactment of these masculinities relate to drinking? That research question drives the aims of this current study. Along with my faculty mentor at the time, Dr. Michael Bauman, and my amazing colleague from Texas State University, Dr. Brandy Pena-Watson, we developed practice-based measures of traditional machismo and caviarismo that closely correspond with existing belief-based measures. A major goal in doing this was to see if gender role practices would be a stronger predictor of alcohol use than gender role beliefs. If we include all of them in a single model, what is their incremental predictive value? But also, if we have a measure of gender role practices that parallels a similar measure of beliefs, then we can take it a step further. We can test how the congruence or incongruence between practices and beliefs predict drinking. If there are discrepancies across masculine beliefs and behaviors, this may explain previous conflicting or null findings. Take caviarismo, for example. Some young men may hold caviarismo ideals, but may not engage in caviarismo behaviors. Thus, a belief-based measure of caviarismo may not associate with drinking. Or, if someone endorses traditional machismo beliefs and also engages in traditional machismo practices, they may be among the most at risk for drinking more. These data come from a two-wave study examining how sociocultural factors predicted alcohol use across the first year of college among Latinx first-time students. For this presentation, I'm sharing findings from the first wave of data collection, which occurred the summer before participants started attending school, so they had not encountered the university environment at this point. For this study, we're only including the men in the sample, so there are 219 participants included in these analyses. So again, we're looking at both TMGR beliefs and practices here. We used Arciniega's scale to measure traditional machismo beliefs and caviarismo beliefs, and we used items that we generated to measure practices that correspond with Arciniega's conceptualization of traditional machismo and caviarismo. Notice that I list 3 dimensions here for that one. I'm going to share in a moment about what happened with our exploratory structural equation model that I ran to identify the underlying factor structure of the TMGR practice measure. But that's in a couple of slides. Here you can see that the reliability estimates of the practices dimension suggest the measures are internally consistent. So again, we'll see in a couple of slides how they stack up with their belief-based counterparts. For alcohol use, we kept it pretty simple for this study, and we're focused on just estimated quantity of use, which we use the DDQR to measure. Since this is a count variable with a heavily skewed distribution, a preponderance of zeros, we did use a negative binomial strategy during regression analyses. Also, all regression analyses controlled for parents' highest level of education. We didn't really control for some of what I typically do with college student samples, which is age and then time since beginning college, since I think 98% of the sample is 18 years old. But before we can figure out how the different domains of TMGR dimensions are related to drinking, we first have to identify the factor structure of the TMGR practices measure. So I did use exploratory structural equation modeling instead of exploratory factor analysis because I did have an a priori assumption about what the factor structure was going to look like since the items were modeled closely after Arciniega's belief-based measure. However, unlike the TMGR beliefs from Arciniega, we found that when we measured at the TMGR at the level of behaviors, a clear single dimension for traditional machismo emerged, but caviarismo was actually separated into two dimensions. So the first was characterized by items capturing respect, chivalry, and using good manners. And the second was characterized entirely by items in the measure that talked about family, such as the example item here, or about holding one's mother in high regard and treating her accordingly. So the rest of the analyses did include three dimensions of TMGR practices along with the two dimensions of TMGR beliefs. So preliminary analyses here looking at descriptives and correlations showed a couple of interesting things. First, as in previous work, dimensions of caviarismo are endorsed much more than dimensions of traditional machismo. Although I don't include tests of mean comparisons here, eyeballing these means does suggest a clear difference. In addition, traditional machismo behaviors are endorsed quite a bit less than traditional machismo beliefs. So while some of the young men in our sample may endorse the traditional machismo ideals, this suggests they may not always be acting upon those ideals. Further, if we look over at the zero-order correlations, they offer strong support for the convergent validity of the practice-based TMGR measures, as they're each strongly and positively correlated with their belief-based counterparts. That said, I couldn't help but notice something else here. So traditional machismo beliefs and caviarismo beliefs are positively correlated with each other, although the coefficient is fairly weak. It's significant. And while the traditional machismo behaviors are strongly negatively correlated with the caviarismo behaviors. So it does seem that this suggests that it's much easier to hold discrepant gender role beliefs, but not so much enact discrepant gender role behaviors. Finally, note here that the only zero-order correlations between alcohol use and TMGR are the positive and negative correlations with traditional machismo behaviors and caviarismo familism behaviors, respectively. So since the alcohol data are so skewed, we do need to interpret that cautiously, but it is evidence that perhaps the TMGR behaviors might do a better job predicting drinking than TMGR beliefs. Looking at the results from the main effects regression analysis, we can see that both traditional machismo variables were the only significant variables in the model, although it does seem that the likelihood ratio chi-square, the coefficient, and the exponentiated coefficient are all larger for the practice's traditional machismo domain than the belief-based domain. None of the caviarismo domains even approach significance. So taken together, these findings track with a lot of the previous research on traditional machismo and caviarismo, positive effects for the former and largely null effects for the latter. The next regression analysis only looked at the effect of traditional machismo domains and the interaction between them in relation to drinking. Again, both beliefs and behaviors are associated with drinking more, and it does seem as though practices may be the stronger predictor, particularly now that caviarismo practices have been removed from the model. But interestingly, and in line with one of the hypotheses for this study, it seems as though it is the combination of having higher traditional machismo beliefs while at the same time engaging in higher traditional machismo behaviors that puts men at the most risk for drinking. To help illustrate this, I took the means of alcohol use in the top 30th and bottom 30th percentiles of traditional machismo scores, and I did put them on a bar graph. Now, for context, keep in mind that these are standardized drinks, and this is an underage sample, so the amount that they're drinking may not seem high compared to older populations or folks who have been in college for a couple of years. Next, I conducted an analysis to assess the caviarismo congruence. Since we had two caviarismo practice dimensions emerge, I created two-way interactions for each with caviarismo beliefs. And what happened was pretty exciting, or at least I thought. I didn't want to crowd this slide with too many tables and figures, so it was one regression analysis, okay, that included all of the caviarismo variables, and I just felt like having the table with the two different figures would be a bit too crowded. So I do want to mention that there were no main effects of caviarismo in relation to drinking in the model either, like with the interaction, or excuse me, the main effect model with traditional machismo. But both of the interaction terms in this model were significant. I was really excited about that finding. And if you look at trends across both interaction effects, they seem to paint a very similar picture. So from these illustrations, we can see that when the young men in our sample endorse both caviarismo beliefs and caviarismo practices low, very low, they drink the most, according to this model. Something else to think about looking at these is that across caviarismo practices, higher caviarismo beliefs are generally protective. However, notice what happens with lower caviarismo beliefs when caviarismo practices are high. There's a drop in use. So recall that past research on caviarismo and drinking largely yielded null findings. To me, these current findings are highly suggestive of needing to model caviarismo practices in addition to caviarismo beliefs to get a better picture of how this set of masculine gender roles may contribute to drinking among Latino young men. So on the one hand, this study lends support to past theories suggesting that drinking alcohol may be a way that some men express masculinity. But I want to stress the importance of thinking of this as some. Some aspects of masculinity are related to drinking more, and some people may endorse those aspects of masculinity. These results and past work underscore the need to consider the complexity of masculinity among Latinos and folks from other populations. There's no one masculinity. There are multiple masculinities, and some of these masculinities may be seen by some folks as negative and toxic, while other masculinities may be seen as generally positive. So from this work, and then also contextualized in previous research, it does seem that some masculine scripts, like traditional machismo, are related to drinking more. And this risk for drinking is particularly strong when someone endorses those masculine ideals while at the same time engages in behaviors related to those ideals. But what is talked about less, and I think should be talked about more, is how some masculine scripts may prescribe drinking less or drinking more responsibly, particularly when those masculine ideals and practices are in alignment. So thinking about this dimensionality of masculinity and about the need to consider congruence across masculine ideals and masculine behaviors may have important implications for identifying people who are particularly at risk, and also in developing successful intervention and prevention programs that incorporate a positive masculine approach. And of course, before signing off, I'd like to highlight some of the primary limitations of this work. So these data are cross-sectional, so we do have to temper our conclusions accordingly. And also, these are 18-year-olds who are self-reporting alcohol use. They may have underreported for fear of consequences, or we may find that these findings don't generalize to older Latino men who have more variation in drinking patterns. Also, there's incredible heterogeneity across Latinx Americans. These data were collected in South Texas, and over 60% of the sample identified as Mexican American, which didn't allow us to examine trends across individuals who identified as originating from other Latin American countries. Finally, the TMGR scale used in this study was developed as part of my dissertation. I'm very excited to share this work with you, but I do fully realize that these measures should be validated in other samples. Again, my thanks for stopping by today. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I mean it when I say don't hesitate to reach out with any questions or comments.